Straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily, we break down week 1 of testimony in the Derek Chauvin trial, what fellow officers are saying about the former Minneapolis cop's use of force on George Floyd.
If your knee is on a person's neck, that can kill him.
Our investigation continues into the man seen in the car with Floyd on the day he died. Could Morries Hall be facing potential charges? Will he be forced to testify?
When you're dealing with the world of drugs, you're not going to have Mother Teresa walking up to the stand.
Plus, how George Floyd's family is giving back to the local community during the trial. Law and Crime Daily, covering court cases from coast to coast. Welcome to Law and Crime Daily, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, in for Brian Buckmire, who's on assignment in Minneapolis. And with us, as always, is Terri Austin. Now, the first week of testimony has wrapped up in the Derek Chauvin trial. Brian, how's the prosecution's case look so far?
So far, so good, Jesse, but remember, we're missing the biggest part of this case, and that's the medical examiner's testimony. So far, we've heard from spark of life witnesses. We've heard from eyewitnesses who broke down crying on the scene with that sense of guilt that they couldn't do anything for George Floyd. Heard from his girlfriend, as I mentioned earlier. But in the last couple of days, we also heard from a lieutenant and a shift sergeant who spoke about both their actions on the scene and the procedures and the lack of procedures taken by Derek Chauvin on that day. It was very interesting. We took a break halfway through today, starting back next week. That's what we've seen so far, Jesse.
All right, thanks, Brian. Now, we know that a police supervisor was called by a 911 dispatcher after watching the officers kneel on Floyd's neck on the city's surveillance camera, the "Don't Call Me a Snitch" call. That supervisor can be heard on Chauvin's body cam video calling him directly after that.
2:30 here. Yeah, I was just going to call you and have you come out to our scene here. Not really, but we just had to hold the guy down. He was going crazy. Wouldn't go in, shutting off for the moment. Wouldn't go in the back of the squad.
He made a reference to shutting off. Can you explain to the jury what that was in reference to?
I probably asked him if he had his camera on or off, since we're having a private conversation.
And that would be within policy, within the body-worn camera policy, for him to shut off during that conversation. Is that right?
Yes.
Did he tell you whether he personally applied any particular type of force or restraint to Mr. Floyd?
I don't believe so.
At one point during the supervisor's testimony, the jury was taken out for the prosecution to proffer the witness. That's to lay the foundation for a very important question. The jury was brought back in, and the supervisor was asked this.
Sir, based on your review of the body-worn camera footage, do you have an opinion as to when the restraint of Mr. Floyd should have ended in this encounter?
Yes.
What is it?
When Mr. Floyd was no longer offering up any resistance to the officers, they could have ended the restraint.
And that was after he was handcuffed and on the ground and no longer resistant?
Correct.
Thank you.
Defense attorney Eric Nelson was able to get the supervisor to make a series of concessions on cross-examination.
Would you agree with the general premise that the use of force is not necessarily attractive?
Yes.
Sometimes officers have to do very violent things. Agreed?
Yes.
It's a dangerous job.
Correct.
And in a force review, there are certain things that you're required to do, correct?
Yes.
That would include having a conversation with the involved officer, right?
Right.
That would involve potentially having a conversation with the suspect upon whom force was used, agreed?
Yes.
Review of the body-worn cameras, right?
Yes.
Review of any other evidence that may exist, such as witness statements, photographs, phone records, whatever it may consist of, right?
Yes.
It's not a huge, very thorough investigation. It's kind of a cursory look, right?
Correct.
And but there's more to it than simply watching a body-worn camera, right?
Yes.
And you did not do a use of force review in this case, did you?
No.
All right, Terri, there was an interesting moment when the defense objected to the prosecution asking about use of force. What exactly was that about, and what was Plougher ultimately allowed to say?
Well, Jesse, the prosecution was trying to get Officer Plougher to answer whether he believed the restraint or the use of force used against Floyd was improper. When Nelson objected, the judge allowed him to do a voir dire, as you mentioned, and ultimately the judge said the prosecution could come back and ask the limited question of whether Sergeant Plougher thought the restraint on Floyd should have ended. And at that point, Plougher said, yes, the restraint should have ended once Floyd was no longer resisting. So he got the point in, but not exactly the way the prosecution wanted it.
So, Brian, if that's what the prosecution is doing here, then what is the defense attempting to do, and were they successful?
Yeah, they were successful. I would even say it was an attempt. That's masterful lawyering right there by Eric Nelson. The facts really aren't on your side from here, from the point of the view of this officer saying, yeah, Derek Chauvin should not have done this. But the defense made the proper objections and limited that testimony, thus taking the sting out of at least this witness to be able to go deeper into whether or not Derek Chauvin should have left his knee on George Floyd's neck or taken it off. I think he also scored a lot of points. You heard some of them in the previous clip, where you're going to hear those again during the closing arguments, where he says, hey, policing's a dirty job. Sometimes it doesn't look so great, but you got to do what you got to do. I think it's really wise for Eric Nelson to go that route.
It's amazing to hear what the bystanders had to say, but now, which we were expecting, the law enforcement experts, this is really what the case is about. So to hear it from their own mouths, it just changes the whole context of this trial. All right, still ahead on Law and Crime Daily, the Minneapolis police lieutenant calling Derek Chauvin's use of force uncalled for and totally unnecessary. But first, the man seen with George Floyd on the day he died, why police arrested him during jury selection, and much more on the investigation into his criminal background. Next. And welcome back, everybody. We're learning more about the man who was in George Floyd's car with him the night he died. Law and Crime's Angenette Levy has been digging into the background of Morries Hall. Angenette?
Jesse, Morries Hall will invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination if called to testify. And we decided to look into why exactly Hall may not want to take the stand.
I'm cool, bro. I ain't that serious.
Put your hand up!
Let me get over here, sir.
No, you're gonna stay right there for me.
Morries Hall was in the front passenger seat of George Floyd's SUV when Minneapolis police approached on May 25, 2020. He'd also been in Cup Foods with Floyd, where they both bought something. Floyd's girlfriend testified that Hall is a drug dealer.
Are you familiar with Morries Hall?
Yes.
And was Morries Hall the person that you and Mr. Floyd bought controlled substances from?
We had.
Hall has a long rap sheet in Texas for drug offenses and in Minnesota. At the time of Floyd's death, he had warrants out for his arrest for third-degree drug possession and felon in possession of a firearm.
What we know is that Mr. Hall is not a very sympathetic figure, and there is some criminal liability, and now he's taken the Fifth Amendment.
Dave Ehrenberg is the state's attorney for Palm Beach County in Florida. We asked him what criminal liability Hall faces.
There are a number of crimes he could have been charged with, from drug crimes to counterfeiting, maybe obstruction of justice. There are a bunch of things he'd be charged with, and so he is clearly trying to save himself.
It's not clear whether Hall had something to do with that counterfeit $20 bill. What is clear is Hall is in custody in Hennepin County for violating a protection order against a woman. He had pleaded guilty to trying to strangle the mother of his child while she was pregnant. Court records show the woman was in the backseat of Hall's car when he was pulled over for an expired license on March 20th in the middle of jury selection in Chauvin's trial. Does Hall have any criminal liability in Floyd's death, given the confrontation with police?
Hall would only have criminal liability in George Floyd's death if the drugs that he allegedly provided George Floyd are what caused George Floyd's death.
When pulled over by police on March 20th, Hall also had another warrant out for his arrest out of another county. We're still working to get information on that case and what that warrant pertains to. His attorney declined to comment when I contacted her. Jesse?
Thanks, Angenette. You know, Brian, what is going on here? What do you think is really going on behind the scenes for why he doesn't want to testify?
Yeah, so Jesse, he's going to incriminate himself. You better believe that Eric Nelson is going to go into both his criminal record, but also his actions on that day of May 25th, 2020. I'm seeing just by eyeballing it, that's possession of a controlled substance, that's intent to sell. Again, maybe if they can make the connection that the drugs in his system, as Eric Nelson is pointing out, actually killed George Floyd, that's a homicide charge. And so all of those, he would be able to invoke his Fifth Amendment right. And so the prosecution got to think, is the juice worth the squeeze? Do I bother putting him on the stand when you can actually just have the video and show everything that he would testify to? So I don't think they're going to extend any kind of courtesy to him to have him testify.
You just asked the million-dollar question. I'll bring it to Terri. If Hall doesn't end up testifying, Terri, you think the prosecution really needed his testimony? How valuable is he?
Well, Jesse, that's a great question. No, I don't think they needed him at all. I think they're better off without his testimony. The jury would probably find that he's not credible because we know already from Floyd's girlfriend, Courtney Ross, that he's a drug dealer, and the jury might think about that. And she even said that she never even liked him. So what the prosecution would have tried to establish is the fact that Floyd was absolutely addicted to the opioids, and maybe they wanted to establish what the scene looked like, but we already know from the girlfriend that he was addicted to opioids, and we already know from the other bystanders what the scene looked like. So I don't think the prosecution needs to call him at all.
Angenette, is this really about Hall, not George Floyd's addiction?
Yeah, you know, George Floyd obviously was a drug addict, and that's not a fault of his. That's a problem that a lot of people in this country are dealing with. There are major parts of this country that have been in the throes of an opioid epidemic for many years now, and many people have become hooked on these things when they're prescribed pain pills, just like George Floyd was, and his girlfriend, she testified to that. So this really isn't about painting George Floyd in a bad light. We just kind of want to show you why Morries Hall, who he was, why he was there that day, and why he may be pleading the Fifth.
Yeah, hey, listen, if you can get another person to explain another portion of the story, that's incredibly useful in this kind of case. And we're already getting all different kinds of angles on what happened that day and afterwards, and clearly before as well. Well, coming up here on Law and Crime Daily, back into the courtroom for the Derek Chauvin trial. Plus, how George Floyd's family is giving back to the Minneapolis community during the trial. Their volunteer work next. The family for each side in the Derek Chauvin case gets only one seat in the courtroom, and members of George Floyd's family decided to take a break from court coverage and volunteered at his former employer, the Salvation Army. George Floyd's sister, Bridget Floyd, is seeing helping out at the Food Distribution Center. Bridget, along with her family, founded the George Floyd Memorial Foundation to provide scholarships and give back to the community. We spoke to two of Floyd's cousins who are also directors of the foundation.
It's a labor of love, if you will. It's kind of like anything that we can do that can, make sure people, he has a legacy of doing things that are positive within the community. And we've always been people that wanted to give back. That's something that he enjoyed doing, working with the youth in the community. So a lot of the programs are touched on things that were important to him.
Terri, do you think creating the foundation will help the family at all with the healing process?
Yes, it will absolutely help them with the healing process. I think it gives them an opportunity to give back to the community. Oftentimes when you have tragedies like this, the families have a hard time getting back into society and doing the everyday daily tasks. I think by volunteering for the Salvation Army, where Floyd actually worked, I think that gives them an opportunity to give back. And all of the other volunteer opportunities that they are talking about really gives them a purpose. And they're doing it all in honor of his name. So I think it's a win-win. It's a great opportunity for both the community and the family.
Now, Brian, it's my understanding you spoke to Rodney Floyd, George Floyd's youngest brother. Did that give you any insight into the family?
Yeah, it did. So during the time that Charles McMillan was on the stand and broke down, the court went into recess and everyone kind of left for a minute. When I went and sat down outside, Rodney Floyd has sat down close to me and I saw that he was struggling somewhat. I shared with him that I am Roman Catholic as well. I know there was a vigil and prayer the day before opening statements, and he told me that the family is very religious, that they're leaving this trial in God's hands, and spoke about how prayer is helping not only him but his family get through this. So it's not surprising that the Floyd family is looking to giving back to the community in any kind of way of service to help in this time of need and hurt.
Yeah, it's not just Derek Chauvin, it's not just George Floyd. There are so many more people who've been affected by this, and it's good that we can get an insight, particularly to George Floyd's family. When we come back, one of the top cops in the Minneapolis Police Department is speaking out against Derek Chauvin. See as he arrived to the crime scene and his letter calling the cops' actions a failure. And welcome back, everybody. While we cover the Derek Chauvin trial, I also want to tell you about another show on the Law&Crime Network, Prime Crime. This week, we're talking about Michael Draka, who became the center of a heated debate over self-defense. A verbal altercation in a Florida parking lot suddenly turned deadly. Draka was charged with manslaughter. We're going to go through this complicated issue with Draka's attorney and a Florida prosecutor. It's Draka's own incredible interrogation tapes, though, that lay out quite the story.
I was standing like this talking to her. I was hit from right here. The shoulder was pulled in front of me, and then I was on the ground. So that time I had to put hand down to get a hand out from underneath. As I come out, I start drawing my weapon. As I start leveling up my weapon, he makes his next step towards me, and 21-foot rule.
So how does this all play out for Draka, and what's the latest in this case? You're going to have to tune in to Law and Crime. Back now to the Derek Chauvin trial, where prosecutors called the head of the Minneapolis Police Homicide Unit who responded to the scene on the night George Floyd died. That lieutenant was one of 14 officers who signed a letter last summer condemning Chauvin's actions.
Have you ever, in all the years you've been working for the Minneapolis Police Department, been trained to kneel on the neck of someone who is handcuffed behind their back in a prone position?
No, I haven't.
Is that, if that were done, would that be considered force?
Absolutely.
What level of force might that be?
That would be the top tier, the deadly force.
Why?
Because of the fact that if your knee is on a person's neck, that can kill him.
On cross, defense attorney Eric Nelson questioned him about a use of force scenario when your life is in jeopardy.
You have never been trained as a Minneapolis police officer to use a knee on the neck of a suspect.
That's correct.
You would agree, however, that in a fight for your life, generally speaking, in a fight for your life, you as an officer are allowed to use whatever force is reasonable and necessary, correct?
Yes.
And that can even involve improvisation. Agreed?
Yes.
Minneapolis Police Department policy allows a police officer to use whatever means are available to him to protect himself and others, right?
Yes.
So if there's a paint can sitting on the table and someone is attacking, you can use that paint can as a weapon.
Yes.
All right, Brian, it seems that Nelson's cross of Zimmerman might be setting the stage for something else. What do you think that might be?
Yeah, it's a very familiar strategy where you're talking to the lieutenant and getting broad, as he said, general standards practices as to what an officer can do to protect themselves. Then he's juxtaposing that. We heard him also say that, well, you haven't been on the street since 1993, basically saying that, well, you're some boss, you don't work in the trenches, which I think is a very common thing that a lot of people will understand. We four may not understand that because Dan Abrams is our boss and he really knows what he's doing, but the common person may say, hey, I do my my job. My boss doesn't really know what I do. And it's setting up for someone who was actually there to testify to what went down. Now, the other 3 officers won't testify to that, but maybe Derek Chauvin will take the stand and say, my boss doesn't really know what he's talking about, but I follow the general things he's saying, and that's why I did what I did.
Wow, that would be incredible if he did that. Now, Terry, what did you think of Zimmerman's cross, in general, because he was a strong witness for the state?
Yeah, I agree, but I think Nelson did a good job with the cross-examination of Lieutenant Zimmerman. And in fact, I think it was a masterclass on cross-examination. One of the things that he did is he asked specific questions to make his points. So, for instance, he said, do you need to look at the totality of the situation to determine the use of force? And each of those questions was yes, no, yes, no. And he went through every single point. And basically, if you look at the transcript of his questions and you take out the answers, that's going to form the basis of his summation. And he actually did it with other witnesses as well. He did it with Officer Pfluger. So I think that he is establishing repetition. He's doing it with each of the witnesses. He's making his points, whether you agree with them or not. And he'll probably do that on summation. So I think he's doing as good a job as he can do with this type of situation.
Terry, real quick, 20 seconds. He basically said that once a suspect's handcuffed, they're really no longer a threat. Did he extend himself a little too far there, Terry?
Yeah, a little bit, but I think it was cleaned up. He said they weren't a threat, and then he tried to say, yes, I think that, of course, if you kicked somebody, that would be a threat. But what he meant was that it definitely lowered the threat level.
Well, okay, we know where he stands against Chauvin, but given that comment, I don't know how the jury might think about it. There's a lot more to cover in this case. Everybody, thanks for joining us here on Law and Crime Daily. We're going to see you next time as we discuss justice in America.